Okay, let's get started. A few announcements before we jump back into the lecture material this morning. As I mentioned at the beginning of the semester, the computer science department is hiring 2 new faculty this semester. We're hiring 1 faculty member in data science and machine learning, and we're hiring a 2nd faculty candidate in cybersecurity. So for each of those 2 openings, we're bringing 4 faculty to campus, which means we have a total of 8 visitors over the next 4 weeks. And we have the first of our 8 visitors today. Paul Bodley is visiting us from Brigham Young University, and he's going to be speaking over in the Davis Center this afternoon. If you can make it, I highly recommend it. We're going to spend a lot of time in this class talking about how to make machines intelligent. There is a related question about how or whether we could make machines creative, and Paul is a world expert on this subject. So if you'd like to learn more, please do come. All of the faculty candidates are coming to campus, meeting with faculty and students, and giving what's called a job talk. So they're going to talk a little bit about what they work on. Some of the talks might be somewhat technical, but it would be a good challenge for the undergraduates here today. This talk in particular, I think, will be accessible to a broad audience, so do, if you're willing and able, come. There is also going to be free coffee and snacks, so a little bit of caffeine and sugar if you need it this afternoon. So make a note, and if you can make it, we'd love to have you join us. Okay, so back to evolutionary robotics. We're working our way through the second of our 6 themes, the tools of the trade. Again, we're doing a very broad treatment of the main tools you're going to be using in this course, which are artificial neural networks, evolutionary algorithms, and physical simulation. Hopefully, all of you managed to submit assignment number 2 last night, and you're now moving on to assignment 3. I haven't posted the submission link to Blackboard yet. Actually, sorry, it is up there. Assignment 3, you're going to be implementing sensors. So you remember robots are made up of lots of parts, objects, joints, sensors, neurons, and synapses. We talked about neurons and synapses in class last Thursday. So you're going to be implementing various sensors into your robot in assignment 3. Just a note to look out for in assignment 3 here, down in step number 23. As you've already noticed, as you go through the assignments, you're going to start making use of a growing number of Python packages. This is probably one of the most important ones that will probably become very useful to you in the years to come. This is matplotlib. It's a great technical visualization package. If you haven't worked with it before, you'll get some exposure to it in this assignment. You're going to be using matplotlib to visualize a lot of the data that your simulation starts to produce throughout the rest of the assignments. So we'll walk you through matplotlib in this assignment. Again, just a good tool to know how to use. Okay. Any questions about assignment 2, assignment 3, assignments in general? We're all good? No installation issues remaining?
Are you going to put up 5 and 6?
I will put up 5 and 6 for the grad students when I get back to my office this morning. Anything else? Okay, let's push on. So just as a reminder, we were almost finished lecture 4. We'll finish that off today, and we'll make our way through lecture 5. So just as a crash course reminder on artificial neural networks, we started with our familiar Bratenberg robots. We threw away the shells and we looked at what was inside. We're going to have visualizations of these neural networks as circles and arrows. Circles are neurons, arrows are synapses. A synapse connects its presynaptic neuron to its postsynaptic neuron, and a synapse influences how much a presynaptic neuron influences the postsynaptic neuron. By doing that, we add weights to the synapses. So the greater the weight is, the more influence the presynaptic neuron has on the postsynaptic neuron. The magic formula for all of the neural networks that we're going to see in this class at root is multiply the value of the presynaptic neuron by the synaptic weight, and then keep a running sum of all the presynaptic neuron values multiplied by their synaptic weights, which give us a raw sum arriving at the postsynaptic neurons. We take those raw sums and we pass it through an activation function, which will squash the value of the neuron back to some pre-specified range. And depending on what we're doing, we might use different ranges. We looked at how you can create how you can create neural networks that encode various kinds of functions, and we can do that by setting the synaptic weights and setting the activation thresholds, the activation functions, and if we're using a threshold function, we can set the threshold value. So by setting the parameters for a neural network, we can get that neural network to compute different values or different functions. We also saw last time that for certain nonlinear functions, like the XOR function, it's not enough to just have synapses connecting inputs to outputs. We also need hidden neurons. So by adding in these hidden neurons in the middle, they allow us to create nonlinear functions, which is going to be useful when we come back to robots, because often robots need to perform a nonlinear transformation of their incoming sensory input to their motor values. And we'll see some experiments where that's useful later on. We then looked at a learning method. Remember, we're looking at evolutionary methods in this class. We looked at learning methods. One of the most popular is backpropagation, where we find some local error at the output layer and we propagate that error back and we change synaptic weights as we go to reduce the error. So by tuning just a few of the weights, we're kind of using these tweezers to fine-tune the function that's encoded by our neural network. And we ended last time with this slide. One of the challenges in neural networks is choosing the cognitive architecture. And again, just to remind you, cognitive architecture is the fancy word for how many neurons, how many synapses, which synapses connect which neurons to which other, what is the general architecture, and then we could use something like a learning algorithm or an evolutionary algorithm to set the synaptic weights and the activation functions for our network. If we choose poorly, in this case we've chosen a cognitive architecture that is very large. We have n patients here, and each one of these n patients is suffering or not, or exhibiting or not a certain symptom. If we have n patients and we're unlucky in our choice and we choose n hidden neurons, what can happen once we train this neural network, once we set the synaptic weights, it might overfit the data. So instead of discovering the underlying pattern between symptoms and disease, instead each of these hidden neurons will learn to compute a subfunction. Remember in the XOR function we had two hidden neurons, one that computed the AND subfunction, the other that computed the OR subfunction, and then combined those subfunctions. In this cartoon example here, imagine that each of these n hidden neurons is learning to a certain subfunction, which is recognize your patient. So hidden neuron 1 recognizes whether the pattern of symptoms is the one that was exhibited by patient 1. The second hidden neuron learns to recognize whether the pattern of symptoms indicates patient 2, and so on. And each of the hidden neurons will turn on when they recognize their respective patient. If, for example, hidden neuron 1 recognizes this is the symptoms of patient 1, we can then set the weight here to indicate to the disease whether or not that patient was suffering from that disease or not. So basically, overfitting is another word for just memorization, right? And this is not a good strategy. You don't want your neural network to do this, because if we now expose this network to patient n+1, and this new patient has some combination of symptoms which is different from all the other patients, our neural network is out of luck, right? So if we have too many hidden neurons, we run the risk of overfitting. If we have too few hidden neurons, as you saw in the case of the XOR function, it cannot learn the function we want. So somewhere in the middle is the right cognitive architecture, and finding the right cognitive architecture is an open problem in AI and machine learning. Once we have a good cognitive architecture, there are techniques out there for discovering the sets of synaptic weights, but finding the right architecture in the first place Still a very difficult problem. Okay, so far so good? Okay. Couple of other elements of neural networks that we're going to need in the lectures to come are recurrent connections. So far, all of the synapses or the connections that you've seen flow downward from the sensor layer to the hidden layer, and from the hidden layer down to the output layer. But we can also have recurrent connections that either connect neurons in the same level or point back up the flow to higher layers. And what do these recurrent connections do? Well, if you have a look at the cartoon in the right there, let's imagine we're trying to compute the new value of motor neuron 1. At this point in time, let's assume that this neural network is sitting inside of a robot, and at that point in time, sensor 1 has fired 1, and sensor 2 has fired 0. Don't worry about what the synaptic weights are at the moment, but it's 1 times whatever that weight is plus 0 times whatever that weight is. And then we have this third recurrent connection in red there that's connecting motor 2 to motor 1. So what value is coming from motor 2 to motor 1? We're going to use the value of the motor neuron at the previous time step. So at this point in time, we're collecting at motor 1 values from 3 presynaptic neurons, sensor 1, sensor 2, and motor 2. 2 of them are reporting the current values of those sensors, and motor 2 is passing in its value at whatever the previous time step was. In this picture here, it's 1 times this synaptic weight. Okay, so the value of this is by adding in recurrent connections, you give neural networks the ability to remember. Right? If we go back to a Bradenberg vehicle, it only has these 2 wires, so it can only respond to whatever the current sensor values are. Right? If those sensor values are the same from one time step to the next, the robot is forced to do exactly the same thing. Right? It can never exhibit different behavior under the same sensory conditions. But the minute we add in recurrent connections, we add in memory and the equivalent of state in a finite state machine, for those of you that know what FSMs are. Okay, so as you can imagine, for a lot of robots and a lot of tasks, it's going to be important for the robot to remember, so we want to make sure to add recurrent connections to allow it to do so. And again, we'll see some evolutionary robotics experiments where they exploit these recurrent connections. Okay. Let's come back to our backpropagation algorithm. Remember, the backpropagation algorithm is a learning algorithm where we take the values arriving at the output layer and we assume that this is a supervised learning task. Supervised meaning as the supervisor, we can tell the network exactly what we expected the value to be at each of the output neurons at that moment in time. Right? So in our truth table over here, if input was ever 0 and 1, as the supervisor we say, neural network, you should output a 1 and a 0 under those conditions. Our network hasn't done that, it's outputted 1 and 1, so there's some localized error over here. So it's the second output neuron that's wrong. And remember, in the backpropagation algorithm, we're going to propagate backwards along the synapses arriving at the erroneous neural network. I've added in some recurrent connections here. So now we're going to have to propagate back along this synapse, and this synapse, but we keep propagating further back when we get to the next neuron. So when we propagate back along that arrow, we get to input 2. There are no arriving synapses there, so we're done. We propagate error back along the arrow connecting to input 1 and update that synaptic weight. There's no incoming synapses to input 1, so we're done following that back trail. We follow this arrow back, and we update that synaptic weight, but now we see there are 3 arriving synapses there, so we have to keep following those 3 back trails. And every arrow here that's in red was touched during that backpropagation of arrows. When I showed you backpropagation a few slides back, I said this is like using a tweezers to fine-tune a neural network. Here it's a sledgehammer, right? We're following all these back connections and we're making changes everywhere. So we may actually improve the error at the output neuron that we started at, but if we're changing everything, we're probably also going to disrupt behavior somewhere else. So there are challenges in learning methods as well in dealing with these recurrent connections. Okay, I just wanted to point that out to sort of point out this idea that there are these two approaches to training neural networks, evolutionary approaches and learning approaches, and they both have their pros and cons. Yes?
Is there a limit on the nodes that go backwards? Because like, how would it get out of that little loop?
It never would. So often when you're following these synaptic back trails, you start to follow them with less probability. So you might flip a coin as you go backwards, and the probability goes up that you'll just stop. But what is that probability? Now you have to figure out what it is. Tricky. Okay, again, just a detail to point out there's pros and cons to these different approaches to discovering synaptic weights for neural networks. Okay, so just to conclude this lecture, just as a reminder, there are these different kinds of learning problems. There are supervised learning problems where we have a whole bunch of features here, or inputs. We have n inputs. And we can tell the neural network under each of these conditions, where one condition is equal to one row here. If you ever see this combination of inputs, this is exactly what your outputs should be. That's a supervised learning problem. If you have a supervised learning problem, if you know this, you probably don't need an evolutionary method. There are learning methods that work very well for this kind of problem. In this class, we're going to be dealing with mostly what are known as semi-supervised learning problems. So we have a neural network, and we may or may not know what values are going to arrive at the sensor layer. We have no idea what the motor layer should be doing. It's exactly why we're doing evolutionary robotics. We don't know how to program the robot to move in a particular way. But at the end of the robot doing whatever it does with a given neural network, we have a single number. In some cases, we have a couple numbers, but for the moment, let's just assume we have a single number. And all we can do is tell the neural network, you did this well. You did 6.3 meters well. So in semi-supervised learning, if we have two neural networks, one obtains 6.3 and the other obtains 8.4, we at least know that one network is better than the other, but we do not know how. And we do not know which part of the neural network led to the network getting a lower fitness value or a higher fitness value. It's a semi-supervised learning problem. Okay, any questions about neural networks before we move on? Okay, so now we're going to switch to a discussion of evolutionary algorithms, which is a class of search methods. And for most of the experiments we're going to look at in this class, we're searching for sets of synaptic weights for a neural network that will get our robot to do whatever it is we want it to do. We're going to look at a number of evolutionary algorithms in this lecture, and in assignments 6, 7, 8, and 9, you're going to implement some of these evolutionary algorithms. So when you get to those assignments, you might want to come back and have a look at this lecture. And we're going to look at these evolutionary algorithms from very simple ones, which are relatively weak, meaning they have a hard time finding the right combination of synaptic weights, up to evolutionary algorithms that are algorithmically more complex, but are more powerful. They're better searchers. Okay, the one thing they all have in common is they have this they're loosely inspired by biological evolution. So apologies to the biologists in this class, but as a computer scientist, when I hear about Darwinian selection, I think of it as an algorithm. We have a population of organisms. There is some genetic variation in that population. Because of that, or partly because of that genetic variation, some of the individuals die off. Others survive long enough to produce offspring. And the two new offspring in this cartoon here are similar but not genetically identical to their parents, which influences their chance of surviving long enough to produce offspring, right? Again, biological evolution is much more complex than that, but that's the basic algorithm that we're going to riff on as we start to create different kinds of evolutionary algorithms. Okay, so if that's biological evolution, this says the genetic algorithm here, but what you're looking at here is a sort of schematic of all evolutionary algorithms. We're going to talk about the genetic algorithm in a moment, which is one kind of evolutionary algorithm. But we're trying to boil this basic evolutionary process down again to its essentials and program that in as code. So instead of a population of organisms, we might have a population of vectors, where each element in the vector you can think of as a gene, and that vector encodes something. And as you can probably guess, for our purposes, these numbers are going to represent synaptic weights. Right? So each vector here represents a guess or encodes a solution to a problem, which for us is a set of synaptic weights for a neural network that's trying to get the robot to do whatever it is we want the robot to do. We usually have a population of them, so in the population we have different sets of synaptic weights. We take each of those vectors in turn and we apply them to our problem. In our case, we take those numbers, label the synapses with weights, try the neural network out in the robot, and measure how well the robot does. So we get back a single number for each of our vectors, which might be how far the robot travels from the origin. Vectors that obtain low fitness or low values are deleted. Those that had higher values, we keep them around. And we then take them and combine them in different ways to produce offspring, which fill the slots recently vacated by the vectors we just killed off. Right? Rinse and repeat. Okay, so all the evolutionary algorithms we're going to look at now are some variation on this theme. Evolutionary robotics is we take an evolutionary algorithm, we attach it to, in your case, PyroSim, some sort of simulator, or in some cases we'll see attaching it directly to a physical robot. The evolutionary algorithm tries out solutions in the simulator or on a physical robot, and rinse and repeat. So that's evolutionary robotics. Here's just sort of another example from an experiment that I am not going to be able to show you. Let's try this again. Okay, here was an evolved solution in simulation. This is called brachiation, fancy name for swinging from tree branch to tree branch. We don't have very sophisticated brachiation here, but you can sort of see what solution evolution has hit on. What is the solution? How is the robot achieving this task?
It swings on a long sort of piece at the bottom, sort of like swing it longer.
Exactly. So that's actually the battery pack. So we actually, as you'll see, I'll show you the physical robot in a moment. We had the physical robot already. We had this heavy battery pack, which was just hanging down. And you can see that evolution has found a neural network that exploits the weight of the battery pack. So it's able to reduce the weight on its hand by swinging the battery pack forward. And by reducing the weight on its hand, it's free to move the hand and grasp while the battery pack is swinging back and forward and back and forward and back. So evolution is exploiting some physical property of the body of this robot. Where did you hear this idea previously? We talked about it last week. What is this an example of? Yep.
The pendulum and swinging light.
Exactly, right? So I gave you the example of how we do this as bipedal locomotors. And throughout this course, we're going to see evolutionary algorithms that exploit the physical properties of an embodied agent. So back in lecture 3, we talked about this idea of embodied cognition, that intelligence starts to arise from evolutionary exploitation of the physical properties of a body. It sort of lays the groundwork for more intelligent behavior. Brachiation may not be the smartest behavior there is out there, but you can already sort of see the beginnings of intelligent behavior. Okay, so that's part of the reason why I wanted to show you that experiment. And then we took that evolved controller, and we had to make a few changes to it, but we then downloaded it onto the physical robot and got something similar. You'll notice the robot is also exploiting the momentum of the battery pack that's hanging down. What's the difference between the simulated behavior and the physical behavior? How do you spot the difference here?
I see that it initially raises the battery pack up to get that sort of initial swing so it can keep heaving itself forward.
That's it, right? So it's not quite exactly the same controller. We had to tune it a little bit to work with the physical robot. Yes?
Strings moving more.
The string, you mean the thing it's...
Yeah.
Right, exactly. So back in the simulator, it was an infinitely rigid rod. Here we just happened to use something that wasn't quite as rigid. It kind of worked, not quite. So one of the open problems in evolutionary robotics is called crossing the reality gap. We evolve a solution in simulation, and evolution exploits the physical properties of the virtual agent in the physics engine. So it's exploited some stuff in there, and we then transfer it to the physical world, and we hope that whatever physical properties evolution exploited in simulation are still there in the real world for it to continue exploiting. It worked in this case, doesn't always work. It's one of the biggest challenges in this field, and we'll see when we come to the theme on open problems, several attempts to solve the reality gap problem. Okay. Okay, so that's evolutionary robotics, evolutionary algorithms plus a robot simulator or a physical robot. Before we discuss different kinds of evolutionary algorithms, I want to introduce this concept known as a fitness landscape. And this is a very important concept. We're going to use it throughout the course. And it's sort of a thought experiment. Fitness landscapes don't exist in reality, but it's a conceptual tool we're going to use to try and understand the pros and cons of the different evolutionary algorithms that we look at. Fitness landscape was introduced in the early 20th century by a very famous biologist, Sewell Wright. And Professor Wright said, imagine that you have this imaginary landscape. It might be in 2 dimensions, like you see in the top left. It might be in 3 dimensions, like you see in the bottom right. Or it might be in 4 dimensions, 20 dimensions. We're going to see 400-dimensional fitness landscapes. We're obviously not going to see them because we can't see in 400 dimensions, but you get the idea. Within whatever dimensional fitness landscape you're thinking about, imagine you have a number of horizontal directions, and the number of horizontal dimensions is always going to be 1 less than the total number of dimensions. In the 2-dimensional case here, we have 1 vertical dimension and 1 horizontal dimension. In the 3-dimensional fitness landscape here, we have 1 vertical dimension and 2 horizontal dimensions, and so on. Each one of the horizontal dimensions is going to correspond to 1 gene in the genotype. So we're also going to use the terms genotype and phenotype throughout this course. Genotype is the blueprint. It's the thing that contains all the genetic information. For us, it's DNA. It might be a vector. If we're encoding synaptic weights, we're going to see other data structures that also store genetic information. We're just going to use this container term genotype for all of them. It's the stuff that contains the information. Imagine that each horizontal dimension corresponds to 1 gene in the genotype, and the vertical axis is going to plot the fitness of the phenotype that was produced from that genotype. So we're going to take the genotype, translate it into a phenotype, and then measure the fitness of that phenotype. For you, your genotype is your 23 chromosomes. Your phenotype is your body and all the things that you do with it. So phenotype is anatomy and physiology and behavior. It's everything. It's the thing that the genome produces. Okay? Okay. For our purposes, the genotype is often going to be a vector of numbers, and the phenotype is going to be a virtual robot running around in a physics engine. Genotype, phenotype. Okay. This will be important later, but we always are measuring the fitness of the phenotype, not the genotype. Okay, so if we have a genotype that only has 1 gene in it, then we have a 2-dimensional fitness landscape. If we have a genotype that has 2 genes in it, we have a 3-dimensional fitness landscape. Most of the problems we're going to look at, there are dozens of genes or hundreds of genes. So for most of the experiments we're going to look at in this course, we usually have very high-dimensional fitness landscapes. Again, which we cannot visualize, but think about it in this low-dimensional sense, either the 2-dimensional or the 3-dimensional case. Okay, let's have a look at the 2-dimensional fitness landscape here. As we march from left to right in this figure here, each point corresponds to a value of that gene. So this value here is the genotype that encodes 0. This genotype here encodes 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, and so on. At each one of those points in the landscape, so every horizontal position in the landscape corresponds to a specific genotype, the values of all the genes, and the height of that point is the fitness of the phenotype produced by that genotype. Make sense? Question?
So I thought when we made the controllers, they like randomly copied themselves and changed a small detail, but it looks like on that graph you have every permutation and combination of gene 1, gene 2.
Exactly. So the fitness landscape, remember, is conceptual. Usually we don't know what it looks like. We know its dimensionality. We say, okay, we've got a neural network with 30 synapses, so we need 30 synaptic weights. So we have 30 horizontal dimensions, and we're going to then try different combinations of those 30 values. And each set of 30 synaptic weights corresponds to one point in this fitness landscape. But we don't know what this fitness landscape looks like. If we did, we wouldn't need an evolutionary algorithm, right? If you look at this picture, what is the optimal genotype in this little cartoon picture here? Where is it in this fitness landscape?
At the peak there.
Right, it's at this point, whatever this is. Let's assume this is the gene value of 1.2, right? You can look at the fitness landscape and know exactly what the value of the gene should be to produce a phenotype with the optimal fitness. The point in all of this is we usually never know what this looks like, and we're going to use an evolutionary algorithm to search or sample across this landscape. Yes?
So I can imagine the robot might get stuck on one of those other smaller peaks.
That's exactly the open problem, right? How do we make sure that when we run our evolutionary algorithm, it doesn't get stuck on one or both of those local peaks and never find the global optimum? We'll come back to that. Exactly. As you can imagine, things usually get worse as you start to go to larger dimensional spaces. Maybe not in this cartoon here, but there are two local optima in the three-dimensional case where our evolutionary algorithm might get stuck. So, again, in the three-dimensional case here, each horizontal position in this three-dimensional space requires two coordinates, x and y, and the coordinate values, x and y, are the values of the two genes. So every point here corresponds to a particular genotype, and the height of that point is the fitness of the phenotype produced by that genotype. So far, so good? Okay. All right, let's have a look at our first evolutionary algorithm. This is actually so simple that it's probably not even an evolutionary algorithm. This is the hill climber. You're going to be implementing this in assignment 6 or 7, thereabouts. Okay, how does a hill climber work? We create one genome or one genotype at random. We set however many values we need. We set them all to random values, which means we start at some random position in the fitness landscape. Let's assume that random individual is the parent. It's the ancestor. And we measure the fitness of its phenotype, which corresponds to the P point in the figure over there. That's its height. We then take that parent, we produce a copy of that vector, and as we copy that vector, we perturb a couple of the values by a small amount. If we copy the genotype and introduce a mutation, we perturb some of the values, you can think of that as moving horizontally a small distance away from P in the fitness landscape. Make sense? You're perturbing the horizontal coordinates of point P. Make sense? Okay, so we produce this new child from the parent, measure the fitness of the child. In this case, the child happens to be less fit than the parent. What do you think happens to the child? Child's gone, parent remains, parent produces a new child. Let's assume in this case, the child happens to be left of the parent in my cartoon here. So the child has higher fitness than the parent. What happens to the child in this case?
It survives in the parent.
It survives, the parent is killed, and the child becomes the new parent, the new P. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Right? If you think about that process on the fitness landscape, you have a hill climber. right? Let's imagine you go to Camel's Hump this weekend. You get out of your car, you take one step in a random direction. If you move down, you move back to your original spot, turn a random angle, take another step. If you moved up a little bit, you stay there, rinse and repeat. If you do this long enough, you may get to the top of Camel's Hump. Or, as you see in this case, you might end up on a local hill, right? So we've fallen into this trap of getting stuck on a local optima. So within a local space of the fitness landscape, if we just look at a small part of the fitness landscape, there may be an optima, right? The highest point in the right-hand side of that figure. But we can get trapped there if we're not careful. So the hill climber is a very simple algorithm. It's very weak. It's very easy to get trapped on local optima. We want to try and find if there is a global optima, plural. There may be equal heights. There may be a mountain out there, but there may be multiple mountains that have the same height. If there is one single highest mountain, then it's global optimum, right? So we're trying not to get stuck on these and continue pushing on to find these. As you can probably tell, the hill climber is not going to do a very good job at that. Okay, so let's throw the hill climber away and make a slightly more powerful algorithm. Now we're starting to get into an algorithm that starts to look a little bit like evolution, because now we don't have a single parent, we have a population of parents, right? One of the hallmarks of evolutionary algorithms is they always maintain a population of different candidate solutions. So we produce, let's say, 2 parents in this case, so we have a population size of 2. We create those 2 parents at random, P1 and P2, and by creating them at random, they materialize at 2 different random positions in the fitness landscape. We measure the heights of P1 and P2. That's generation 1. We're done. We've generated our genomes. We've evaluated the fitness of the phenotypes. Now we move on to generation 2. We take each parent, and each parent produces one and only one child. In this case, C1 and C2. And then we do the same thing we did in the hill climber, we just do it in parallel. We take each parent-child pair. If the child is more fit than the parent, kill the parent and the child becomes the new parent. If the parent is more fit than the child, kill off the child and make a new child at the next generation. So now we have something that's starting to resemble an evolutionary algorithm. We have a population of different candidate solutions. They produce offspring. At the next generation, we evaluate the offspring, go on to the next generation, next and next and next. How does the parallel hill climber do relative to the serial hill climber, the plain hill climber? Does this algorithm stand a better chance of avoiding local optima and finding the global optima? Yes, how come?
Because you have a population.
Because you have a population, right? It's pretty simple, right? We're just going to try a whole bunch of things. So instead of you going to Camel's Hump this weekend, you rent a van, collect all your friends, drop them off at random positions in the foothills of Camel's Hump, and get everyone to do a hill climber and call in on their cell phones and report their altitudes, right? Let's see who actually found Camel's Hump. A little bit better, but sort of still somewhat inefficient, right? We have to drop a large number of points, which again is one of the challenges in evolutionary algorithms. Yes, we can probably find the global optima if we drop enough points, but how many points is enough? Population size of 2 in my cooked example here is still not enough to find the global optimum. Will 3 do it? 4, 5, 6? What's the probability of finding the global optimum? How does that probability increase as I increase the size of my population? It goes up, but I don't know by how much. Right? Okay, so slightly more complex, a little bit better at doing the job. Let's look at something that, if done right, will help here. This is the genetic algorithm. Looks like the parallel hill climber. We're going to start in the same way. We're going to create a population of random parents. And now, instead of every parent producing one and only one offspring, different individuals are going to produce more or less offspring. If your fitness value in the population is lower than others in the population, you produce no offspring. If your fitness is sort of mediocre, you're near the average fitness in the population, you produce maybe 1, maybe 2 children. If your fitness is above average, you produce 3, 4, 5, 6 children. So now you're going to produce more children depending on your relative fitness to others in the population. Okay, that's one difference. The other difference is how you produce children. I've already mentioned this idea of mutation, which we can see here. When we had back in the hill climbing, we had a parent and produced a child. We visited one or a few values and then perturbed that value by a small amount, right? That's mutation. We have one parent produces a mutated child. Now that we have multiple parents and multiple children, we can introduce a second variation operator, which is sexual recombination. So now we pick in our population 2 parents at random. We're going to pick 2 parents that have higher than average fitness because it's those that are producing children. So we've got the red parent and the blue parent. We then pick somewhere along the vector a crossover point represented by the vertical line here. And to produce the first child, we're going to start reading off from the left-hand side of the red parent, copy all those values into the first child, and when we hit the crossover point, we're going to cross over to the second parent, the blue parent, and start reading off the blue values and copy those remaining blue values into child 1. So, like us, this child is some combination of genetic material from its 2 parents, and in a genetic algorithm, you usually produce a second child, which is the inverse of the first child. We take all of the blue material to the left of the crossover point and all of the red material from the right-hand side of the crossover point. 2 parents producing two children. So this is now starting to look much more like biological evolution. Why introduce crossover? Why did Mother Nature discover sex, discover recombination? What's its value?
You could say that like when you combine two techniques that are working correctly, it can go wrong. You can take bad things from both. But ideally, in a lot of cases, you can take like a full idea or like a full approach to a concept that thing has learned, and then take those little full categories of things rather than just like taking different traits at random.
That's it. Exactly right. So as you mentioned at the beginning of your statement, sometimes recombination goes wrong and you combine the worst of 2 worlds. But sometimes recombination will take good genetic material, good genetic subsets of material from 2 parents and combine them into a child which benefits from the partial solutions of the 2 parents, right? You're bringing together the best of both worlds. Where do you need to chop a pair of given parents' genomes? Where do you need to choose the crossover point to do that? Hard to say, right? You really only know once you evaluate the children.
Does it eventually get to like, do we factor in like dominant versus recessive traits?
Do we dominant and recessive traits or alleles?
Yeah.
You can do that. In this case, we're dealing with haploid genomes, right? You usually don't deal with diploid genomes where for every gene you have 2 values, the 2 alleles. There are some evolutionary algorithms that do build in diploidy. We're not going to look at any in this class, but you can do it. Haploid genomes for us. Okay, so remember back to our discussion about neural networks, and we looked at the XOR neural network. That XOR neural network had 2 parts inside, one that computed and one that computed or, and then combined those results. Imagine that we have 2 neural networks, both of which are trying to figure out and or. So evolution is setting the weights so that in both networks, they're kind of approximating and kind of approximating or, but it's not perfect yet. Imagine further that in these 2 parent neural networks, one of them is doing a better job at approximating and than the other one is, and the second parent is doing a better job of approximating or than the first parent is. Right? One is better at and, the other is better at or. If you cut those 2 neural networks at just the right place and bring the better and the better or together, You'll have a child that approximates XOR better than either parent. Right? It's possible, doesn't always work, but that's the hope when you build in recombination to an evolutionary algorithm. Okay, what does that mean on the fitness landscape? Well, on the fitness landscape, you may have two parents that are actually pretty far from one another horizontally in the fitness landscape. What does it mean for two genomes to be horizontally very distant from one another? What does that tell you about the two genomes?
That they have very different settings, kind of.
They have very different settings, right? For our cases, that's usually synaptic weights, right? So the further the further the two genomes are from one another horizontally in the fitness landscape, the more different the value of their genes. So you can have P1 and P2, which are very different networks. One which is doing a good job at approximating and the other one which is doing a very good job of approximating or. They're very different, but if you cut them in just the right way, you can produce two children which are also quite different from their parents, right? We're combining different genetic material from two different genomes. But if you combine the best of both worlds, you can often escape the local optima that the parents are trapped on. So in our cartoon here, let's imagine P2 is trapped on the good and but bad or local optima. Can't seem to get off that hill. And the other parent is trapped on the good or but bad and local optima. We want to get to the good and good or global optimum, right? So by combining the best of both worlds, we might get there. We might produce a child that lands on the slopes of a global optimum. And that child might then produce further children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren that through mutation, which are slight changes, like the hill climber, might then, C1 might produce children and grandchildren that through mutation creep up and actually reach the global optimum, the top of Camel's hump. Make sense? Yes?
So then you could potentially have both a genetic algorithm like this working in combination with some children doing hill climbing and some children doing genetic.
Exactly. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. So in the genetic algorithm, it doesn't just rely on crossover, which we just talked about. It's usually crossover and mutation. So often what will happen is once you've finished evaluating all the parents, you're going to start producing children, and you might flip a coin. Heads means mutation. Pick a parent and produce a mutated child. Tails, pick two parents and cross them to produce two children. So mutation and crossover are going on within the same population. Thank you, I forgot to mention that. Okay, so we're getting better, but as you can imagine, there's still lots of room for improvement. So let's visit another evolutionary algorithm. This is the evolution strategy. And the evolutionary strategy was designed a long time ago to deal with a certain problem that crops up in fitness landscapes, is that certain fitness landscapes are more rugged than others, right? We have a smoother landscape in the top right and a rugged landscape in the bottom right. What does that mean? What does it mean to have a rugged landscape?
I would think it means that the robot would get stuck more often.
It would get stuck more often, right? If it's pretty rugged, if you're in a very rugged mountain range, then doing the hill climbing trick and maybe even crossover isn't going to do it, right? There are many, many, many local optima, and there still may be one or very, very few global optima, so it's easy to get stuck. But what does it mean about the structure of the space itself? Remember that a fitness landscape is a way of thinking about the space of all possible genomes.
The global optima is very, very narrow, so it would be very easy to jump past it.
It would be very easy to jump past it, right? So if you want to think fitness landscape, the picture is a visualization of the structure of all possible genomes. And an evolutionary algorithm is some way of sampling that fitness landscape. You've got a whole bunch of points that are jumping around on the surface of this landscape, right? So if you have a rugged landscape, yes, it's very easy to jump over it. the structure itself in a rugged fitness landscape tells you that two genomes, which are very similar, they have very similar values, which means they're close to one another horizontally, may be very different from one another, may be very distant from one another vertically. So two very similar genomes may have very different fitness, right? Remember the vertical axis here is fitness. So that's what it means when I say a rugged fitness landscape. You make a slight change, and suddenly you get much higher fitness or much lower fitness. How do we deal with that? Especially because, again, before we start searching the space, we have no idea what it looks like. We don't know whether it's smooth, we don't know whether it's rough, and in most real problems, there are certain parts of the space that are very rough and other parts of the same space that is very smooth. This makes things very tricky because we don't know the magnitude of the jumps we should make, right? If we're in a rugged fitness landscape, which we don't know, we should make small jumps. If we're in a smooth fitness landscape, which we don't know, we should make big jumps. So how do we decide how big or how small the jumps we should make? The genius of the evolution strategy is, this seems like a very non-intuitive problem, picking the size of jumps to make, turn it over to evolution. So now we have, in the simplest evolution strategy, and again there are versions of this algorithm, but in the simplest one, we have a vector of the genes, which in our case encode synaptic weights, and for each single gene, we have a corresponding number, which is the step size. And the step size tells us the magnitude of the jump to make if we ever perturb that gene. So if we take this vector here, we copy it, and we pick the second gene for mutation, we might pick a new value for that gene that is centered at the current value at 0.4, and we may move away plus or minus 0.2, somewhere in that range. So anywhere, we might pick a new value anywhere between 0.2 and 0.6 for that gene, right? So we're making a relatively large jump for the second gene, but a pretty small jump for the first gene. When we mutate this genotype, so both vectors is the genotype, remember the genotype is the blueprint, it's all the genetic material, we might pick a gene for mutation, or we might pick a step size for mutation. We might mutate the mutational step size itself. Make sense? Sounds good, but the moment you think about this method, there should be an obvious question you want to ask. You might have a different question, but...
Well, like, do you change one? Do you change both? Like now you have
you have more numbers to pick.
An explosion of like a bajillion times more things to change.
Absolutely, right? So now we've doubled the size of the genotype, right? So you can actually think about the fitness landscape as now doubling the dimension, right? If we think about all the genes and all the step sizes, we've actually made the problem bigger. So we took a hit in that case. We're hoping that that hit is going to be compensated for the fact that the size of the step is going to adapt to the ruggedness of the fitness landscape. Okay, let's just build up an intuition for this. In the top right, imagine, again, we don't know it, but our current point, let's imagine we're just doing a hill climber for a moment. We have a single point, and the step size for that single gene is 0.1. So plus 0.1 or minus 0.1, in that range, given where the point is at the moment, half of the new values will produce a child that is worse than the parent, which is the values on the right-hand side of the point, and half the new values for that gene will produce children that are more fit than the parent, right? On the left side of the point. Sounds good. If we take the same genome, but now assume it's actually a rugged fitness landscape, and we have our point sitting here, it's actually doing pretty well, right? It's on the slope of Camel's Hump, it's on its way to the global optimum. If we take the same sized step size, plus or minus 0.1, the vast majority of children in that mutational range are going to be worse than the parent, right? It's only within this very narrow band that a child might survive and kill off the parent. Okay, so imagine that this parent produces a child which is a very short distance away from the parent horizontally and survives. That's information. It says, aha, a smaller step size happens to work for that gene. So the child might have a smaller mutation size. So we can either evolve these step sizes or we can try and set them based on how the population is moving through the fitness landscape. The thing that unites all versions of evolution strategies is they're trying to tune the step size as we learn more about the fitness landscape. Make sense? Okay. Let's move on now. We're now going to look at a problem, not an evolutionary algorithm. The problem is symbolic regression, and we're going to look at an evolutionary algorithm that solves this symbolic regression in a moment. So, like the problem of getting a robot to do whatever we want it to do and then applying an evolutionary algorithm to solve that problem, we're going to look at a non-robotic problem at the moment, which is symbolic regression. Does everybody know what linear regression is? We set some function, and we'd like to try and learn the slope and y offset of this equation, which is, hopefully you remember, a straight line. And we're going to try and get that straight line to fit some data that we have. We're trying to produce a model, which is an equation that captures some pattern in our data. And I'll show you some data in a moment, but that's linear regression. Imagine that we have something like this. We don't even know that the way of capturing the structure of the data is a linear model. It might be a straight line, it might be a curved line, it might be something else altogether. So in symbolic regression, we're going to ask the search method to not just discover parameters of a fixed model, we're going to ask it to discover the structure or the symbols that make up the model itself. And the model is the thing that's going to try and represent structure in some data. That's symbolic regression. That's the problem. Okay, so first of all, we're going to start to address this problem by encoding different equations in not a vector, but a tree structure. So for the non-computer scientists here, these two little pictures here are trees. We always have a root node, which is the circle at the top. We have internal nodes, which are nodes that receive arrows and send out arrows. And we have leaf nodes, which are the ones that are dangling at the bottom of the tree. Okay, we can use trees to encode equations if internal nodes and root nodes include operators or branch nodes. So we have a whole bunch of operators over there on the right, sine, cos, plus, minus, algebraic, trigonometric operators. We can pick one of those operators and put it inside one of these internal nodes. And at the leaf nodes, we can put either a number or a variable. Okay, so I've built two trees here, P1 and P2. As you can probably guess, these are going to become parents 1 and parents 2 in a moment. But for now, they're just two different equations. What two equations do these trees encode? What does P1 encode? I hear someone giving me the answer, but I can't see it. Did you have an idea?
0.8 plus x times 1.4.
Yeah, so again, we're sort of working to read this off. You have to read from the bottom up. So 0.8 plus x times 1.4, right? And then reading P2 from the bottom up, x plus y divided by, 0.2 divided by x plus y. Make this a little easier on you. There we go, right? A little bit more familiar. So again, take it from me, you can encode arbitrary equations in trees, and trees with different structures and different labels of the nodes. You can encode different equations. Okay, so we now have two different trees, P1 and P2. These are not vectors, but trees, so we have two genotypes. And there's the genotype. And then the phenotype is the equation itself, the thing that they're encoding. With two different trees, two different equations. I just showed you recombination for vectors. We're now going to recombine genetic material from these two parents to produce two children. Well, like in the genetic algorithm, we need to pick inside the two parents the crossover point. Where are we going to cut them? In this case, we're going to cut P1. We're going to pick a node at random. So in P1, we pick the red node. And in P2, we pick the plus blue node. When we pick that crossover point, we look at the subtree that's rooted at that node. In the case of the red node, there is nothing underneath it, so the whole subtree is just that one node. In the case of the blue plus sign, it has two nodes underneath, so we're going to take all of that blue genetic material. We're going to pull the genetic material off of the two parents, swap it. Right? So we pull 1.4 off of P1, and we glue it back on to the attachment point in P2. We pull the blue genetic material off of P2, and we're going to glue it onto the dangling arrow in P1. Right? So in the same way we swap genetic material in two vectors in the genetic algorithm, we're swapping genetic material in two trees in the two parents to produce, again, two children. And if you read off the equations down here, these two equations are similar to, but not identical to, the two parent equations. What can you tell me? What's different between recombination in symbolic regression and in the genetic algorithm? One obvious difference is we're dealing with vectors in one and trees in the other. What other differences arise from that difference?
The left tree now has the y variable, whereas the right tree has the y variable.
Absolutely, right? So now this function is now a function of x and y, and up here it was just x, right? So we've changed the structure of the equation in C1 compared to P1. What else has changed?
Your C1 is a whole lot bigger than P1, so your code is growing.
Absolutely, right? So genetic recombination in biological chromosomes and also in genetic algorithms most of the time produce two new genotypes which are the same size as the two parent genotypes. As you can see in this example, that is no longer true in symbolic regression. We can make bigger or smaller genotypes. They can grow or shrink. And as you mentioned, they also can have different structure. Okay, so we've been talking about symbolic regression. We're going to search over the space of all possible equations now. And the fitness of an equation is how well it fits some data that we have. Okay, so let's start to look at some data now. Let's imagine we have an x variable and a y variable, and we sample from some system. We're going to produce some data. We're going to make some measurements from some system. Doesn't matter what that system is. We get back these points. We're going to arrange the data into a table as you see here, where each column corresponds to one of our variables, and we want to try and represent an equation that will produce a line that is as close to all these points as possible. Hopefully by visual inspection you'll notice that this one ain't gonna cut it, right? You're not going to find a very good straight line that approximates all of these, or that gets close to all these points. Remember your high school algebra very quickly now and do some symbolic regression in your head. What is the equation that might fit this data well? Obviously I haven't numbered the axes, so we can dispense with the numbers. What's the general form of the equation we want here?
X minus 3 squared.
X minus 3 squared, that sounds pretty good. Okay, so just for fun, let's imagine that we produce a population of equations at random, like I just showed you. And one of the equations in that population actually happens to be y equals x. And we then measure the fitness by taking each of the points and measuring the vertical distance of the point from the line, right? So all of these thin black lines here, if we sum up the lengths of all of those thin black lines, that's the fitness or the error of the equation. So up till now, we've been talking about genotypes, and genotypes that have high fitness survive, and those with low fitness die off. We can flip this around and think about members of the population that have high error are going to die off, and individuals with low error are going to survive and produce offspring. Right? So as you can imagine, this equation is probably going to die pretty quickly. It has relatively high error, therefore low fitness. That looks like a much better fit, right? I think that's right. Okay, so we're going to search over the space of equations to try and fit our data as well as possible. Let's look at a real-world example. This is actually some research going on here at UVM. As you may or may not know, Lake Champlain suffers from time to time in the summer from toxic algal blooms. These toxic algal blooms appear in different bays in the lake, different summers at different times, and it turns out it's very difficult to predict when and where these blooms will occur. We know that these blooms tend to respond to the amounts of nitrogen in the water, phosphorus in the water. They also it has something to do with temperature, turbidity, so how clear is the water, how much rainfall was there today, a week before the bloom, a month before the bloom, who knows, right? So before we had X and Y, now we have X1, X2, X3, X4, X5, and Y. So we're dealing with a high-dimensional problem here. So the thing that we're trying to predict is what is going to be the toxic algal bloom in a particular bay at a given time. Okay. It turns out that any one of these things, so T equals N, doesn't work. The amount of algal blooms doesn't just correlate with the amount of nitrogen. T equals P also doesn't work. Like y equals x didn't work on the previous one. What is it? Who knows? So we have some faculty here who are actually trying to apply genetic programming to this problem. So as I mentioned, symbolic regression is the problem we're trying to solve. We want to find an equation that describes toxic algal blooms as a function of nitrogen, phosphorus, water temperature, and so on. And we're going to use genetic programming to do it. So genetic programming is the last evolutionary algorithm we're going to talk about today, which encodes individual solutions as trees rather than vectors. Sound good? Okay. Okay, last one we will finish up with today is, I just talked about symbolic regression, the problem, and genetic programming, the solution. You can apply genetic programming to all sorts of things. We'll end today with kind of a fun example here. We're going to try and approximate an image of the Mona Lisa. You can go watch this online. Okay, so I'm going to run this 2-minute video. And obviously we have the real thing on the left here, and on the right is the best tree in the population at the first generation. Remember, all of the trees in the population in the first generation are all at random. So the genotype is a tree, and the phenotype is the thing on the right, is a picture. I haven't told you in detail how we're encoding the genotype yet, so I'm going to play the movie. And you're going to see a whole bunch of phenotypes on the right, but you're not going to see the genotypes. So when we finish the movie, I want you to try and think of a way, what might those genotypes look like? What information might they be encoding? Are the genotypes encoding whatever it is? Okay, so remember we have a tree, right? And in that tree is a whole bunch of different subtrees. So different subtrees are probably encoding not triangles. Polygons. Remember that trees can be arbitrary sizes. So larger trees encode polygons with more sides. Smaller trees encode polygons with fewer sizes. But obviously these little subtrees that are encoded in the larger overall tree are not encoding just the shape of the polygon. Position of the vertices, yes, but what is the position? Fill, color, right? RGB is probably in there somewhere. One other position, fill, exactly. polygons. You can evolve ellipses of arbitrary shape and size and orientation and all sorts of different things. Okay. Okay, so I think we're finishing a little bit early today, but that's fine. Just as a reminder for those of you that came in late, we have a visitor from Brigham Young University today giving a talk on computational creativity at 1:15 in the Davis Center. Free cookies and coffee. Attendance sheet is up here. You have a quiz due tonight, and I will see you on Thursday. Thank you.